Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Bad Sister by Kevin O'Brien. Narrated by Anne-Marie Lee. Chapter 1. Saturday, October 6th, 2018. Rhododendron, Oregon. Nate Berquist wondered if he'd survive this weekend with his brother. They were on their way to the family cabin near Mount Hood National Forest, about an hour southeast of Portland. It was a tradition going there for their birthdays. The brothers were born 4 years and 1 day apart, October 7th and 8th. They'd missed coming here last year. Nate's older brother Gil had insisted on this trip. He said he didn't want to see the tradition die. But Nate couldn't help thinking his brother had another reason for this hasty getaway. Gil drove fast, with his window halfway open. The wind tousled his near-shoulder-length golden blonde hair. Not many people at 36 could pull off the long-haired preppy look, but Gil made it work for him. Riding shotgun, Nate felt his stomach tighten as they took another curve in the highway. He listened to the tires squeal and braced his hand against the dashboard. Route 26 narrowed down to 2 lanes as it wound through the woods, and at times it seemed choked with RVs. But that didn't slow down his brother any. He kept passing the trailers and motorhomes, one after another. The needle on the speedometer of Gil's Audi coupe hovered near 80. "Hey, Steve McQueen, what's the goddamn hurry?" Nate almost had to shout to be heard over the wind whipping through the car. "The cabin isn't going anywhere. Would you mind slowing down?" Leaning to his left, Nate spied his girlfriend Renee in the rearview mirror. She and Gil's new girlfriend, Cheryl, sat crammed together in the back seat. The wind had done a number on their hair. Renee rolled her eyes and mouthed, "Thank you," to him. "Pussy," Gil muttered, shifting gears. Nate half-turned in the passenger seat to address the women. "Are you sure the wind isn't too much for you back there?" "Right now, it's the least of my worries," Renee replied, shouting over the sound of the wind. She was pretty, with green eyes, freckles, and long, wavy, tawny brown hair. A yoga instructor, she had the taut, trim body that came with the job. She was Nate's age, 32. She leaned forward and put a hand on his shoulder. "Please tell me again there will be alcohol when we reach our destination, if we reach our destination." "Every time he gets behind the wheel, Gil puts pedal to the metal," Cheryl announced. She smoothed back her blonde hair. "I've gotten used to it. Actually, he's a very good driver." "I'm an excellent driver," Gil said, imitating Dustin Hoffman's character in Rain Man, a movie the two brothers had seen multiple times while growing up. The two of them often launched into their own language of movie quotes that no one else understood. "Kmart sucks," Gil grumbled. "We have pepperoni pizza for dinner Monday nights." Cheryl laughed. Renee rolled her eyes again. "For $1,000, what was Dustin Hoffman's name in that movie?" Gil said. "Raymond Babbitt," Nate answered without hesitation. He turned forward again and noticed the speedometer had gone down to 65. "And Tom Cruise was Charlie, the much cooler, better-looking, younger brother." "That's only true in the movies, bub," Gil said. Nate was grateful his brother had eased up on the accelerator. For a while, he'd thought Gil might have someone on his tail, not just because of his crazy driving, but also from the way he kept checking his rearview mirror. Gil was a private detective, and weird little episodes of intrigue were a hazard of his profession. If someone was indeed following them, it would be like Gil not to say anything that would worry the womenfolk. Nate checked the side mirror. No one was behind them. Now that they weren't driving so fast, he could actually enjoy the scenery along the way. The familiar creeks and small waterfalls, the evergreens bordering the highway, and all the other trees ablaze with autumn colors. Nate knew Gil had slowed down mostly for Renee's sake. His brother and Renee were like cordial adversaries. They managed to tolerate each other. As Renee put it, "I like Gil, but he's an asshole a lot of the time, and I don't like the way he treats you, especially in front of me." She'd made that painfully clear when Nate had introduced her to Gil over dinner at McMenamin's 2 years ago. After 90 minutes of listening to their brotherly banter, Renee had cleared her throat. "Excuse me, Gil," she said calmly over her creme brulee, "but I don't appreciate you calling Nate pussy, douchebag, doofus, or wuss. I know you're trying to be funny, but I don't find it amusing at all." "Well, okay," Gil had said, looking stumped. He'd turned to Nate. "So, how about those trailblazers, bro?" At first, Nate had been embarrassed. He'd wanted his brother to like Renee, and here she was slamming Gil's standard shtick, and a tradition of verbal abuse that had thrived for at least a quarter of a century. It was really none of her business. Yet Gil respected her. Nate noticed he tapered off on the name-calling after that, at least in front of Renee. Gil still liked to goad her on occasion, but never pushed it too far. He was pretty much behaving himself for this trip, so far. "What was I talking about before you interrupted and jumped on my ass about my driving?" Gil asked, his eyes on the road. "You were telling me that I should switch jobs, and I wasn't listening," Nate answered. "Just let me say this," Gil went on. "Frank at the agency, you know my friend Frank, he wrenched his back. So he went to Kaiser and they had him see this physical therapist there. The woman spent 45 minutes showing him some stretching exercises. Then she printed up some exercise instructions for him and sent him on his way. They charged Frank $390. I'll bet that's a hell of a lot more than you get per hour at the Veterans Hospital. According to Frank, this girl was like phoning it in. She didn't exactly break into a sweat." Nate squirmed in the passenger seat. "I'm sure Kaiser gets most of that $390, he said. "And maybe the therapist seemed apathetic because she doesn't like her job. I happen to love where I work. I love the guys. I like helping these veterans put themselves back together again." Nate hoped Renee would keep her mouth shut. Earlier this week, he'd complained to her that one of his new patients had spit on him. In truth, the job wasn't always the love fest he made it out to be. Occasionally, he got patients who were genuine jerks. That was true in any job. But most of the guys who came to him were still traumatized and in pain, and his job was to inflict even more pain on them and teach them to tolerate it. Whether it was on an exercise mat, on a pair of parallel bars, or in the shallow end of a pool, he had to push these broken men to their limit. Many of them were amputees. Nate had to help them adjust to using prosthetics, and he might as well have been torturing them. But by the time they'd completed their therapy, most of his patients were grateful. Nate had become like a war buddy with some of these guys. He'd wiped away their tears, lifted and carried them, and cheered them on. Once they were whole or pretty much independent, Nate always got a lump in his throat saying goodbye to them. They made him feel essential and seemed to look up to him. It was a feeling he never got from his older brother. "All I'm saying is that you work like a dog and they pay you shit," Gil said. He checked the rear-view mirror again. "It took 7 years to earn your degree, and for what, Nate? How much do you rake in a year? 50, 55 grand? Nate turned toward his window. "Around there," he mumbled. He was pretty sure his brother didn't make much more as a private detective. Nate used to look up to Gil, who had been kind of wild when they were growing up. He attracted people with his charm, his good looks, and his athletic prowess. He was a tough act to follow. Much of Nate's identity was wrapped up in being Gil Berquist's kid brother, and that had made him proud until late high school. Then he'd started to resent it. Time had shifted things around a bit. Nate was in great physical shape from working out with his patients every day. He was tall, with blue eyes, wavy black hair, and a goatee. As for Gil, though still handsome, he'd gotten paunchy. He'd had 2 failed marriages and rarely saw his only child, a 9-year-old daughter who lived with the first ex-wife in Ashland. His private investigation business was unsteady. He was probably in debt up to his elbows and certainly couldn't afford the Audi. If someone was actually following them on the highway, it was probably a repo man. Gil was always pushing the envelope, living beyond his means. 2 nights ago, when he'd called Nate about this trip, Gil had mentioned that he was about to score a shitload of money. "And how exactly is that going to happen, Sherlock?" Nate had asked. "I'm not at liberty to say, but it involves some information I've dug up for a client. Valuable information, it turns out." "This doesn't sound very above board," Nate had said warily. "In fact, it sounds way under the board. What's going on?" "The less you know about it, the better. But if everything goes according to plan, I'll be sitting pretty next week." "Jesus, Gil, I can't believe this. What are you doing, pulling a bank heist or something?" "That's it. I'm Thomas Crown." He'd chuckled. "Relax. It's nothing that serious. Forget I even said anything." To Nate, it sounded like extortion, what with that talk about the valuable information Gil had dug up for a client. Gil had gotten into trouble before with other shady get-rich schemes. He'd been lucky not to have his detective's license revoked or been arrested or worse. And yet here was Gil, Mr. Shady Deal, doling out career advice to him. "If I were you, I'd tell the VA hospital to take this job and shove it," Gil said as he took a curve in the highway. "Then I'd find some cushy work at one of these healthcare providers. Or you could start your own business, like I did, work out of your house for a while, no overhead. Anything but that miserable hospital job." "I'll take that under advisement," Nate replied. He didn't say anything else to his brother. He turned and asked Cheryl about her job behind the Enterprise rent-a-car counter at PDX. That kept her talking for the next 30 minutes. They turned off the highway onto a rural road and then to a gravel trail that snaked through the woods. Nate listened to the pebbles ricocheting against the underside of the car. He noticed the turnoff to their closest neighbor's cabin, which meant they had a half-mile to go. It was getting dark, but Nate still spotted certain landmarks along the way, including an old metal Smokey Bear sign he'd nailed to a tree 20 years ago, and Gil's initials carved in another tree closer to the cabin. Then there was their mother's birdhouse on a pole that never stood straight. The Leaning Tower of Pisa birdhouse, the family used to call it. The birdhouse was pretty dilapidated now. The vacation home, a 3-bedroom log cabin with big windows and a porch in front, looked slightly neglected as well, at least from the outside. Parking by the porch, Gil popped the trunk. They unloaded their overnight bags, some groceries they'd bought for the weekend, and a cooler full of perishables. While the women turned on the lights and opened some windows to air out the place, Nate went to the side of the cabin and got the water pump going. He noticed Gil at the end of the driveway, glancing up the gravel trail. Nate caught up with his brother as he started back toward the cabin. "What's going on?" Nate asked. "Are you expecting someone?" Gil squinted at him. "What do you mean?" "On the way here, the way you drove and the way you kept checking the rearview mirror, I thought someone might be following us or something." Gil chuckled and shook his head. "We're fine. God, what an imagination." You know, you always used to get spooked out whenever we stayed here for the weekend with Mom and Pop. Nothing ever changes." Once they stepped back inside the house, Gil switched on the porch light. Nate wondered why he'd turned on the outside light if they weren't expecting anyone. The plumbing in the cabin was ancient but reliable. Nate could hear the pipes moaning. Gil was upstairs in the shower. Renee and Cheryl were in the kitchen knocking off a bottle of red wine. The cabin had sufficiently aired out and was now getting chilly. Nate made the rounds from room to room, closing the windows again. He noticed that Gil had turned on all the outside lights, including the ones in back and 2 floodlights that were fixed on trees by the driveway, so everything was illuminated around the cabin. Beyond that, it was just a wall of trees and darkness. The moon wasn't out tonight. From his parents' CD collection, Nate had James Taylor's greatest hits playing on the old boombox in the living room. Fire and Rain was just the tune for his nostalgic mood. His brother used the family cabin a lot more than he did. Nate hadn't been here since they'd lost their dad. Their mom had been the first to go, 3 years back. She'd died from pancreatic cancer at age 59. His dad remained alone in the Lake Oswego house Gil and Nate had grown up in. He started drinking heavily. Nate tried to intervene and even moved in with him for a while, but nothing he did seemed to help, so eventually Nate gave up and moved back into his own apartment in Portland. One Friday night, 18 months ago, their dad got drunk, slipped, and hit his head on the corner of the breakfast table. He lost consciousness and never woke up. When Nate hadn't been able to get him on the phone the following Sunday, he swung by the house and found his father on the kitchen floor. He'd bled to death from the gash in his head. Nate was devastated and blamed himself for giving up on his father months before. In his job, he never quit on his patients, but his dad was so selfish in his grief. As Gil had pointed out to him, the old man didn't make any effort to be strong for us after we lost our mother. He just wanted to numb himself with booze and shut everyone else out. At the time, Gil was dealing with divorce number 2, and he was kind of bitter about everything. While Nate made the funeral arrangements, Gil had an estate broker go through their parents' house. This guy cleared out the place before Nate had a chance to go through his parents' things. Gil didn't seem to understand why he was so incensed. His brother assured him that they'd split down the middle whatever the estate broker raked in from the sale of their parents' earthly possessions. That didn't include their mother's jewelry. Gil's second wife had made off with most of the valuable pieces the year before. In the end, Nate got a check from his brother for $2,300, which was probably less than what the dining room set was worth. Never mind all the other furniture in the house, the electronics, the silver, china, and various antiques. Nate wasn't sure if it was the estate broker ripping them off or if Gil was holding out on him. Nate paid a lot more attention to the details when they sold their parents' house. But by then, things between Gil and him were slightly strained. It wasn't so much that he minded getting cheated out of the money, though he didn't like being treated like a chump. He figured Gil was desperate for funds. He was always in some kind of financial trouble. No, what really bothered Nate was that he hadn't been able to hold on to some of the things that reminded him of his mom and dad and his childhood. Since their dad's death, the two of them had gotten together only a few times, for lunch or dinner. But for Nate, it was always sort of a chore. They both knew their relationship wasn't the same, and they both knew it wouldn't do any good to discuss it. But just a couple of days ago, Gil had the bright idea about this trip, with Renee and Cheryl in tow. He was adamant about it. As an extra lure, Gil said he had several items from their parents' home, items the estate broker hadn't wanted. Nate didn't understand why his brother hadn't told him about these rescued family treasures until now. In fact, the sudden urgency for this birthday getaway seemed oddly suspicious. Nate couldn't help wondering if, for one reason or another, Gil needed to get out of town for a while. Perhaps things were so dicey he even needed to make sure his girlfriend and his brother weren't left behind. At least he'd been telling the truth about the family treasures on display in the cabin, like the big oil painting of a Swiss chalet which now hung over the sofa. The picture had been painted by their mother's best friend. Nate had never liked it much, but he was happy it hadn't ended up with strangers. The semi-kitschy painting had been in his parents' living room for as long as he could remember. Gil had shoved most of the things he didn't know what to do with into the small bedroom off the kitchen. The junk was still there in boxes. Nate figured he'd sort through all of it after dinner. He saw that Gil had placed some familiar knickknacks and framed family photos on the mantel of the River Rock fireplace in the living room. Nate had always thought the room resembled a lodge with its hardwood floors, knotty pine walls, and the high vaulted ceiling. In one corner there was a winding staircase to the other bedrooms and bathroom. Another corner had an alcove with a desk. When he was a kid, Nate used to spend his evenings in the tilt-back swivel chair drawing. Sometimes he'd imagine a bear emerging from the dark woods and crashing through the big window in front of the desk. As he grew a bit older, Nate's imaginary killer bear was replaced by a man in a hockey mask carrying a machete. Gil was right about his overactive imagination, back when they were kids, at least. Nate heard the pipes squeak and realized his brother was finished showering upstairs. Gil had mentioned starting a fire in the hearth after dinner. Nate stepped outside and gathered up some logs from the stack on one side of the cabin. During a second trip for another load, he thought he heard something moving nearby in the woods. It sounded like footsteps, twigs snapping. He stopped and listened for a moment. He didn't see anything, just the tree branches swaying in the night wind. Nate gathered up the logs, brought them inside, and unloaded them in the brass bin by the fireplace. He went back to the door and closed and double-locked it. "Nate, could you come in here and help us with this damn stove?" Renee called. None of the appliances in the kitchen matched, and each one was older and quirkier than the next. The biscuit-colored fridge made all sorts of ghostly noises. The dishwasher was a dull stainless steel and left all the glasses looking cloudy, and the ancient gas-range oven was chipped white enamel with a temperamental pilot light. Nate caught a whiff of shrimp when he stepped into the kitchen. A big bowl of them sat on the counter. Tonight's dinner menu was garlic butter shrimp, steamed vegetables, and pasta. "We've used up a box of matches trying to get this stupid oven lit," Renee announced. Moving over to the counter, she poured some more wine into her glass. "And speaking of getting lit, I'm having another glass of this Cabernet. Cheryl, can I top you off?" "You don't have to twist my arm." Nibbling on a cracker, Gil's girlfriend stepped away from the stove and held out her wine glass for Renee. Nate chuckled. "I have a feeling you two will be hammered by dinner time." "You almost say that like it's a bad thing," Renee quipped. Nate kissed her on her shoulder as he stepped around her to the counter. He started to open the junk drawer where they kept the extra matches. That was when he saw something outside the kitchen window. He froze as two people staggered from the shadowy woods. "Oh, my God," Renee said behind him. She must have seen them, too. It took Nate a moment to figure out it was a man and a woman, both wearing dark jackets. They didn't look like hikers or campers. At least they weren't wearing backpacks. In all the times he'd stayed at the cabin, Nate had never encountered a stranger anywhere near the house. It didn't make sense that this couple had just come out of nowhere. The man was balding and about 30. As he approached the cabin, he seemed to notice Nate in the window, staring back at him. The guy waved and then started limping. The woman's short-cropped dark hair was messy, and she had dirt on her face. She looked exhausted. "Help us!" she cried. "For God's sake!" Suddenly, Nate heard the back door being unlocked. He turned away from the window in time to see Cheryl opening the door for the two strangers. "Are you hurt?" she called. "We couldn't get any goddamn cell phone service," the man yelled. "Our car broke down. We started walking and got lost." The woman spoke over him. The guy almost knocked Cheryl down as he staggered into the kitchen. He pushed the door open wider, and it banged against the wall. His companion followed him in. "We thought we were going to die out in those fucking woods," he gasped. "We've been walking around for at least 3 hours. Are either of you hurt?" Nate asked. They'd never answered Cheryl's question. "My ankle. I twisted my goddamn ankle," the man said, plopping down in a chair at the breakfast table. He accidentally knocked over Cheryl's wine glass. It hit the floor and shattered. Red wine spilled across the worn linoleum tiles. "Oh, fuck," he groaned, sounding angry. "I'm sorry, okay?" The woman half collapsed in the other chair. "I'll clean it up," Cheryl said. "Where do you guys keep the mop and the broom?" Nate pointed toward the broom closet. "There. Thanks, Cheryl." He turned to the man again. "Where's your car?" "I don't know," the man grumbled. He looked down at his foot and winced. "Hurts like a son of a bitch." "He's a physical therapist," Renee said. "You should have him look at it. He knows what he's doing." She filled 2 glasses with water and then stepped around the mess on the floor and set them down in front of the couple. The woman greedily drank her water, but her friend, still gasping, scowled at his glass. "Shit! Don't you have anything stronger?" Nate hesitated. Something was wrong. It wasn't just the unsettling way these two strangers had barged into the house and wreaked havoc. Nate could have sworn that when he'd first spotted him emerging from the thicket, the man hadn't been limping at all, and the dirt smudge on the woman's cheek looked phony, almost cliched. Nate wasn't sure about the cell phone reception in the middle of the woods, but he'd always been able to get phone service in the cabin, and certainly on the highway. "Something stronger?" Nate repeated. He couldn't believe the balls on this guy, turning down a glass of water and practically demanding that they raid the liquor cabinet for him. "I'll get you some brandy," Gil said. Nate swiveled around to see his brother in the doorway to the kitchen. He was dressed in jeans and a V-neck sweater. His hair looked damp, and he was barefoot. "We keep the hard stuff in the living room," Gil explained to the man. "Nate, check out his ankle for him, okay?" He turned and headed toward the living room. Nate wondered why his brother didn't seem the least bit wary of these two. Plus, he wasn't exactly dying to look at this guy's ankle. Renee was using paper towels to soak up the spilled wine while Cheryl, with the broom, swept the glass into a dustpan. Nate turned to the man again. "Let's have a look. Which ankle is it?" The guy immediately pulled his foot away. "Don't bother yourself. I just need to stay off it for a little bit." Nate noticed for someone who had been traipsing through the woods for 3 hours, his shoes didn't look very dirty. Past James Taylor's singing and the sound of Cheryl sweeping up the glass, Nate thought he heard Gil whispering on the phone in the next room. "So, you don't have any idea where you left your car?" Nate asked, to distract the man. "Alongside one of the roads off the highway," the woman answered for him. "And you didn't walk back to the highway for help?" Renee asked, dropping a wad of soggy paper towels into the sink. She turned to them. Why in the world did you go into the woods? You'd have had a lot more luck getting help by flagging down a car on the highway. Yeah, well, we were at least a couple of miles from the goddamn highway.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?